NBC News now calling GOP control of the Senate.
That's with the victory of Deb Fischer, the incumbent in Nebraska, who was given quite the run for her money from an independent there, Dan Osborne, who said he wouldn't caucus with either side. But it went down to the wire. But in the end, the Nebraska Senate goes back to the Republicans, and that gives a leg up to Republicans and the gains they need to take control of the Senate.
They should have won it based on how the map looks, and obviously we are now projecting that they have it here. You've got that Nebraska pickup. Montana is still hanging out there. I'm also looking at some of these other races that are very, very close where there are Democratic incumbents in the Senate. So this is significant, obviously, for the balance of power in Congress and for whoever ends up in the White House, especially if it is former President Trump. A lot of eyes are going to be on what the House does, where the House goes here, with that landscape looking very different, of course, those critical races.
Why don't we ask Ryan Nobles, our colleague who is here somewhere?
He covers it. Go the building.
He covers Capitol Hill.
Where you are.
Right, what we know now is the Republicans have control of the Senate. What we don't know is the margin, and you still have a very vulnerable Democratic seat out west in Montana. We wait for Michigan. We wait for Wisconsin. What are you hearing?
Yeah, Savannah, I think of all the outcomes that happened here tonight, this is probably the least surprising. Republicans felt very confident about their chances of winning back the Senate, just given the map. There were 10 competitive Senate races across the country. 8 of them were held by incumbent Democrats. And the places where they were battling out these races were in places where the elections were expected to be very competitive. And we see that playing out here in a big way tonight. I do think perhaps the most interesting dynamic that's now playing out at this hour is that where Senate Republicans were confident of winning the majority, but they were very much talking to us about the idea of 50+1. They just wanted 51 seats to make sure that they would have the Senate majority leader, that they could control the legislation that came on and off the Senate floor. They're now talking about perhaps significant margins. They are now looking at that blue wall the same way that we are looking at the blue wall in terms of the race for president, and seeing real opportunities for pickups in places like Wisconsin, in places like Michigan, in places like Pennsylvania. These were areas where Democrats were hopeful because they had strong incumbents there, or they had strong challengers, people running in open seats like in Michigan, who they thought they'd be able to run ahead of Kamala Harris, even if the race was close at the presidential level. Donald Trump's margins seem to be bringing those Republican candidates along with him in states along that blue wall. And then don't forget, there's 2 other Senate seats that are still on the balance as well. I know you already talked about Montana, which Republicans feel very confident about, but we also have Nevada and Arizona. Arizona Republicans were not that bullish on. They did not have high hopes for Kari Lake, the candidate there. The scenario in which they thought Kari Lake could win is the scenario that we see playing out right now. And that was a big Donald Trump victory that would bring her across the finish line. So there's no doubt that there are a lot of very happy people in the Senate Republican caucus. And this is going to be a very different looking Senate Republican caucus, one that might look a lot more like the House Republican caucus that we've covered over the past couple of election cycles. So there's no doubt that there's going to be a lot of change in Washington as a result of what we see playing out here.
You have a major call to make at this hour, and it's the power of the Senate moving forward. It's precisely what we've just been talking about with this conversation. Republicans will take control of the Senate with that call in Nebraska. Deb Fischer holding on to her seat tonight. If Donald Trump is named the next president, he will have a Republican Senate. We do not know who will control the House, but this is significant. And now the only question is, Rachel Scott, is how strong that Republican control will be. Will he have a mandate, because the majority will be more than just a one senator majority?
Yeah, spot on. It's not a question of whether or not Republicans are going to have the majority. It's just now a question of precisely how much. This is going to be the outlook, at least where it stands right now. Republicans 51 seats, they've netted 2. Remember, that's all they needed to net by the end of the night in order to take control of the Senate. Democrats currently have 41 seats. And again, David, we talked about these key races, but I just want to emphasize one more time when we're talking about Republicans possibly expanding their majority in the Senate. Wisconsin, you have the Republican candidate ahead. Michigan, the Republican candidate ahead, and also in Pennsylvania as well.
And we have breaking news at this hour just into CBS News election headquarters. CBS News can project Republican Deb Fischer will win re-election in the state of Nebraska, and that means we can now project that Republicans will take control of the Senate. This flips the Senate, which Democrats had controlled, with Vice President Kamala Harris's tie-breaking vote. Scott MacFarlane.
You see the number behind me, Nora. That's the magic number for Republicans. They're there. We're projecting 51 seats. That gives them control of the U.S. Senate. That gives the next president a Republican Senate. So impactful when it comes to Supreme Court nominations, a cabinet, legislation, border bills. All of this now will go through a Republican Senate, which, by the way, does not have a designated leader yet. Mitch McConnell is stepping back. Let me show you how we got to 51 and tell you what's still ahead. First off, Ohio, where Sherrod Brown, a resilient Democrat in Ohio, had strong labor support, had strong backing in the 3 C cities of Ohio, Cleveland, Columbus, Cincinnati. After 3 terms, we project he is lost to Bernie Moreno, the Republican businessman from Ohio. That's 1 seat lost from the Democrats. West Virginia was an uphill fight from the jump. The Republican governor, Jim Justice, served 2 terms in Charleston, projected as an overwhelming winner over Glenn Elliott. That's the seat vacated by the retiring Joe Manchin. There's 2. Montana is, at this point, projected as a lean Republican for Tim Sheehy, the businessman from West Virginia. I'm sorry, the military veteran from Montana, the 3-term Democrat John Tester there. Democrats haven't really defended so much in the battlegrounds. They have a good situation in Arizona, where the Phoenix Congressman Ruben Gallego has a lean standing right now against Carrie Lake, the Republican in Arizona. Michigan, Pennsylvania, Nevada. Those familiar battleground states are also battleground states for the U.S. Senate. We deem Michigan a toss-up right now. Mike Rogers, the former congressman, against Alyssa Slotkin, who, by the way, represents the same district Rogers once did near Lansing. In Nevada, the incumbent Jackie Rosen against Sam Brown, another toss-up state for the presidential race, toss-up state still for the Senate. Democrats playing defense there, and they're playing defense in Pennsylvania, where Bob Casey, the 3-term Democrat, in a toss-up race against Dave McCormick. So at this point, Nora, you get a sense. Republicans have secured a majority. Now it's a matter of margins. Democrats are vulnerable to losing 2, 3 more seats as this night goes on. And for the Senate, every single piece of that puzzle, every single seat along that margin is impactful. Wow.
Fascinating to see those numbers and the Republican performance amongst those Senate candidates there, including Dave McCormick in Pennsylvania. That's his 2nd race for the Senate there, of course, and looks like he is in good position to win the contest there. One of the things is we're now past 1 o'clock in the morning, and as more of the vote comes in, and we know it has been a strong night for Republicans and Donald Trump, the question is, what was the composite of the electorate? Where did Donald Trump do well? Where did Kamala Harris not do well? So, John Dickerson, when you look at the exit polls, what have we learned about her performance with women?
And we could go through a variety of different areas, but let's just talk about women, because there was so much discussion about how women were going to be key to a Harris victory.
That there was going to be this giant gender gap, that women were going to come out overwhelmingly for Kamala Harris.
And particularly the gender gap would be driven by this overwhelming victory by Harris among women. Donald Trump was always going to do well among men, but she was going to swamp him with women. Well, the exit polls at the moment show, and they've shown this all night, that Harris has 54% of the female vote. Trump has 44%. That's just a 10-point gap. So in 2020, Joe Biden got 57% of the female vote. So he did 3 points better than Kamala Harris. But this is what's interesting to me. Donald Trump has done better with women voters. He did better in 2020 than he did in 2016, just by a little. And then in 2024, he has done better with women voters than he did in 2020. So he has improved with women voters. And think about the way he ended his campaign. You know, in a traditional sense, and his campaign advisors, some of them were saying this, is you've got a problem with women voters, college educated, women in the suburbs. And he did very little. In fact, some would argue he leaned into his problems with women voters, and it didn't hurt him in the least in the electorate.
What does that say to you, John? What does this mean?
Well, what it says is that there is no, you know, when Donald Trump won in 2016, there was some conversation about, well, the office will change him. Yes. There will be people around him who will help with his rough edges. the office.
He'll become presidential.
There's no question that Donald Trump is Donald Trump in full. He ended his campaign purely, fully Donald Trump, and that is what Americans, it appears, are signing up for. It's certainly what the exit polls show. He has a lot of support for that.
And he went through a primary where he was challenged by other Republicans. Nikki Haley, a former governor, someone who worked under him as the UN ambassador, out there just recently saying he wasn't going to win supporters when it comes to women because he's alienating them with his remarks. But she lost that primary, and perhaps her bet here isn't it's not as clear cut. I mean, it's just interesting again and again to come back to the two things that Trump voters told us. It's the economy and it's the border. Yeah. Largely, the Democratic ticket avoided discussing the border and immigration as much as they possibly could. There's going to be a lot of analysis of should they have leaned in and talked about it in a way other than there was a bill that should have, would have passed.
Well, over whether Joe Biden, as one of his first acts as president of the United States, should have repealed so many of those executive actions and initiatives that had really locked down the border, that Donald Trump successfully was able to run against him.
Fox News projects that the Republicans will take control of the United States Senate. The party will hold at least 51 seats, which is enough for an outright majority.
The tipping point for this is Nebraska, where Fox News can now project that Republican incumbent Senator Deb Fischer will defeat independent challenger Dan Osborne. Now, this was a very, very tight race. The incumbent Republican pulling this out. And that means, because of Bernie Moreno and West Virginia, that it now goes over the top as far as the Senate majority. But we don't know the final number yet.
Right. We're still waiting for the Tim Sheehy race against John Tester in Montana, which is one that I think a lot of Republicans felt was something they were relying on. So we'll see if that turns out to be the case. And it's not clear yet who would serve as the next Senate Majority Leader. Republican leader Mitch McConnell, who is the longest serving Senate leader in history, announced earlier this year that he would step down. So there's a lot of speculation about who might take that role. And of course, that'll be the next conversation to have for the leadership in the Senate. But right now, a 51-seat majority for the Senate, 42 seats for Democrats. And this is a big deal for if President Trump wins again, he needs this majority in the Senate. We don't know what's going to happen in the House.
Republicans will win back control of the United States Senate. We can make this projection because CNN projects Republicans win the U.S. Senate seat in Nebraska. The GOP picking up enough seats to reclaim the majority that they lost 4 years ago. This is a huge victory for Donald Trump's party as we're still waiting the final outcome of the presidential race.